I sat across from Sarah and smiled, saying, "This place feels quieter than usual, doesn't it?" She nodded and said, "Yeah, it's nice. Peaceful." I leaned back and replied, "I needed peaceful tonight. Work drained me." She laughed softly. "You always say that." I shrugged. "Because it's true. But sitting here with you fixes it." She looked at me and for a moment I felt safe. Truly safe. I thought marriage was this feeling, this calm trust where nothing ugly could reach us. I believed love meant not questioning every silence. The waiter came and asked, "Ready to order?" I said, "Yes, 2 pastas and mineral water." Sarah added, "And garlic bread." The waiter smiled and walked away. Sarah placed her phone on the table. I wasn't looking at it until it lit up. Just a vibration, just a name I didn't recognize. I said casually, "Someone texting you this late?" She didn't answer right away. Her fingers froze just for a second, but I saw it. She said, "Oh, it's nothing. Probably spam." I chuckled and replied, "Spam has names now?" She forced a laugh. "You're impossible." I nodded, pretending I didn't feel that strange pinch in my chest. I told myself I was overthinking. I always told myself that. I watched her flip the phone face down. I asked, "Everything okay?" She said quickly, "Yes." "Why wouldn't it be?" I raised my hands. "Just asking." Silence settled between us. Not heavy, not loud, just different. I remembered the first time I met Sarah. She had spilled coffee on my shirt and apologized 10 times. I told her, "It's fine," and she smiled like she didn't believe me. That smile had followed me into marriage. I trusted it more than my instincts. She said, "You're staring." I smiled. "I was just thinking how lucky I am." Her eyes softened. "You always say that." "Because it's true," I repeated. The waiter returned with the food. He placed the plates down and said, "Enjoy your dinner." I said, "Thank you." Sarah whispered, "Smells good." I replied, "Everything tastes better with you." Her phone vibrated again. This time I didn't pretend not to notice. I asked, "Still spam?" She hesitated, then said, "Yes. Just ignore it." I nodded. "Okay." Inside my thoughts started whispering. Why ignore something harmless? Why turn the phone over? I hated myself for thinking like this. I had promised myself never to be that suspicious husband. Sarah took a bite and said, "You're quiet." I said, "Just tired." She said, "You should eat." I picked up my fork but couldn't focus. I watched her eyes flick toward the phone again and again. I asked gently, "Do you want to check it?" She shook her head. "No. Dinner matters more." I smiled but my heart didn't. I remembered telling her once, "I trust you completely." She had replied, "That's why I love you." I said softly, "You know you can tell me anything, right?" She looked at me surprised. "Of course. Why are you saying that?" I shrugged. "No reason." Another vibration. Longer this time. She swallowed hard. I asked, "Sarah?" She took a breath and said, "Let's eat." I couldn't sleep that night. I kept seeing Sarah's frozen fingers, her forced smile. I turned toward her and asked, "Are you awake?" She murmured, trying to sleep. I said, "Same." Silence stretched between us, sharp and uncomfortable. The next morning, she was in the shower when her phone buzzed on the bed. I didn't plan to look. I swear I didn't. But the screen lit up and the name was clear. Zane. My chest tightened. I whispered to myself, "Zane?" She had mentioned that name once long ago. She had laughed and said, "Just someone from the past." When she came out, I asked casually, "Who's Zane?" She stopped drying her hair. "What?" I said, "Your phone lit up." She frowned. "Why were you looking at my phone?" "I wasn't," I said quickly. "It just showed." She said, "He's nobody." "I told you." I nodded. "You said he was from the past." "He is," she replied too fast. "Why are you digging?" "I'm not," I said, but my voice didn't sound convincing. At breakfast, her phone stayed face down. I said, "You're quiet today." She said, "I'm just busy." "With what?" "Life," she snapped, then softened. "Sorry." Later, I met a deal for tea. He asked, "You look tired. Everything okay?" I hesitated. "Do you ever feel like something's wrong but you can't prove it?" He leaned back. "That's marriage anxiety." I said, "What if it's not?" He shrugged. "Then talk to her." That evening I called my sister. Miriam listened quietly, then said, "What's bothering you?" I said, "She's hiding something." Miriam replied, "Or you're afraid she is." I said, "She's changed." Miriam sighed. Silence is sometimes louder than truth. That line stayed with me. Silence. Loud. Screaming. Over the next days I noticed everything. Her phone never left her hand. She stepped out to take calls. When I asked simple questions she answered like I was accusing her. I said one night, "You've been distant." She said, "You're imagining things." I asked, "Am I?" She replied, "Yes." But my instincts wouldn't rest. I hated myself for doubting her. I wanted to be the man who trusted blindly. I said softly, "If something's wrong we can fix it." She said, "Nothing's wrong." One afternoon I came home early. I heard her voice in the bedroom. She whispered, "You shouldn't call me." I froze. She said, "No, I can't talk like this." I stepped closer. The floor creaked. She turned and gasped. "How long have you been there?" I asked, "Who were you talking to?" She said, "No one." I said, "Sarah?" She looked away and whispered, "I have to go." She ended the call and stood there, silent. I sat across from Sarah and said, "We need to talk." She folded her arms and replied, "About what?" I said, "About Zane." She looked away and said, "Why are you bringing him up again?" I answered, "Because he hasn't gone away." She sighed and said, "He's just messaging me." I asked, "Messaging you why?" She said, "He says he wants closure." I repeated, "Closure?" She nodded and replied, "Yes, that's all." Her words felt practiced like lines memorized before a play. I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She answered, "Because I knew you'd react like this." I laughed bitterly and said, "Like what? Asking questions?" She snapped, "You're making it bigger than it is." My chest burned with jealousy I didn't want to admit. I asked quietly, "Do you still feel something for him?" She said quickly, "No, too quick." I said, "Then why does he think he deserves access to you?" She hesitated and replied, "He just can't move on." That answer humiliated me more than anger would have. I said, "What kind of man is he?" She shrugged. "He's successful. Confident. He always was." Each word felt like a small cut. I forced a smile and said, "Sounds impressive." She frowned and replied, "Don't twist my words." I leaned forward and said, "I trust you." She looked relieved and said, "Thank you." Inside my stomach twisted. I didn't trust her. I trusted the version of her I married, not the woman rehearsing excuses in front of me. Later that week Farah came over. She laughed and said, "Sarah, you still talk to Zane?" Sarah froze. I looked up and asked, "Still?" Farah blinked and replied, "Oh, I thought you knew." The room went painfully quiet. Sarah said sharply, "Farah, stop." Farah looked confused and said, "I'm sorry." I asked calmly, "How long has this been going on?" Sarah said, "It's not what you think." I nodded and replied, "That's what scares me." Farah whispered, "I'll go." When she left, Sarah said, "She misunderstood." I said, "No, she didn't." My thoughts raced, connecting dots I had ignored. Late replies. Hidden smiles. Defensiveness. The picture I feared finally took shape. I said, "You lied to me." She replied, "I protected you." I laughed softly and said, "From what?" "The truth." She shouted, "I didn't cheat." I said, "Not physically." The silence after that was heavy and unforgiving. She whispered, "I was confused." I answered, "You didn't look confused. You looked careful." She cried and said, "I never meant to hurt you." I replied, "Intent doesn't erase damage." My voice surprised even me with its calmness. She reached for my hand and said, "Please understand." I pulled away and replied, "I am understanding too much." I stood up and said, "I need space." She asked, "Are you leaving?" I paused and said, "I don't know." That night I lay awake listening to her breathing. Every word she had spoken replayed in my head. I wanted to believe her, but belief felt like betrayal to myself now. Trust no longer felt safe, it felt foolish. The next morning she said, "I'll block him." I replied, "That's your choice." She asked, "Does that help?" I shook my head and said, "It helps you, not me." She started crying again and I felt strangely empty. I said softly, "I wanted honesty, not perfection." She whispered, "I'm sorry." I nodded, already drifting away emotionally. I realized something painful then, something final and heavy, something I couldn't undo or ignore anymore. I trusted her words, but my heart had already started packing its bags. I saw the message by accident. Her phone lay unlocked on the couch, lighting up with a sentence that wasn't meant for me. "I miss how you used to understand me." My name wasn't there. His was. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't need to. Sarah walked in and said, "Did you see my charger?" I asked calmly, "Do you miss him?" She froze. "What?" I said, "The message answered it." She whispered, "It's not what you think." I nodded. "It never is." She stepped closer. "I didn't sleep with him." I replied, "You didn't have to." She said, "It was just talking." I asked, "About us?" She shook her head. "About life." I smiled faintly. That was my place. She cried and said, "I made a mistake." I answered, "Mistakes are accidents. This was a choice." She grabbed my arm. "Please don't shut me out." I gently pulled away. "I already have." From that day I stopped reacting. When she spoke, I listened without emotion. When she cried, I felt distant. She asked, "Why are you so calm?" I said, "Because I'm tired." She said, "You're scaring me." I replied, "I was scared first." I buried myself in work. My manager said, "You're staying late these days." I said, "I need focus." He nodded. "You're doing great." Those words felt better than sympathy. At home, Sarah tried harder. She said, "Let's go out." I replied, "I'm busy." She said, "Talk to me." I answered, "There's nothing left to explain." One night she asked, "Are you planning to leave me?" I said, "I'm planning to survive." She cried and said, "I blocked him." I replied, "That should have happened without fear." Zane started calling more. I didn't confront him. I didn't warn him. Sarah said, "He won't stop." I asked, "Do you want him to?" She looked away. "I don't know." I nodded. "That's enough of an answer." I met a lawyer during lunch. He smiled and said, "Just information?" I said, "Just clarity." He replied, "Sometimes clarity is freedom." When I came home, Sarah said, "Where were you?" I answered, "Learning." She asked, "About what?" I replied, "My options." She panicked. "You're leaving me." I said, "I'm leaving confusion." She whispered, "I'll fix this." I answered, "You already broke it." She said, "He means nothing now." I replied, "He meant something when he shouldn't have." She reached for me. "Don't give up." I stepped back. I didn't give up. I woke up. That night, Zane texted again. She said, "He says he loves me." I laughed softly. "He loves attention." She asked, "Why aren't you angry?" I answered, "Anger gives people importance." I slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. No questions. No hope. Just clarity. In the morning, she said, "What happens now?" I looked at her and said, "Now I choose myself." That day I didn't lose my wife. I found myself. I didn't hear about Zane from Sarah. I heard it from silence. One evening she said, "He lost his job." I replied, "That's unfortunate." She waited for more. I didn't give it. She said, "He was under investigation." I asked, "For what?" She shrugged. "Office politics." I nodded. Politics always reveal character. Days later she added, "His new girlfriend left him." I asked calmly, "Already?" She whispered, "She said he never stops talking about me." I replied, "That sounds familiar." Sarah started hovering around me like a stranger afraid of being seen. She said, "You don't talk anymore." I answered, "I talk when there's something to say." She asked, "Do you still love me?" I said, "I respect myself." That answer hurt her more than shouting ever could. She said, "I was confused." I replied, "Confusion doesn't send late-night messages." She said, "He needed me." I asked, "And I didn't?" Her voice broke. I felt invisible. I said, "So you made me disappear." She cried quietly. I stayed quiet louder. Zane kept calling her. She showed me messages now like proof. She said, "See, I ignore him." I replied, "You should have ignored him from the start." She whispered, "I know." One night she said, "He's begging." I asked, "For what?" She said, "Another chance." I smiled faintly. People always want chances after consequences. At work, my manager said, "You've changed." I asked, "In a good way?" He said, "In a strong way." Those words stayed with me. At home, Sarah tried memories. She said, "Remember our first trip?" I replied, "I remember trust." She said, "We can rebuild." I answered, "Ruins aren't foundations." Her friend Farah called me. She said, "Sarah is breaking." I replied, "She broke something else first." Farah whispered, she regrets everything. I said, regret arrives late. Sarah finally said it all one night. She said, I liked feeling chosen. I asked, by him? She nodded. By anyone. I replied, marriage isn't an audition. She said, I never planned to leave you. I answered, but you planned to escape. She cried, I was weak. I said, weakness isn't betrayal. Hiding is. I felt pain then, sharp and real, but no weakness followed it. She asked, why are you so calm? I replied, because chaos taught me silence. Zayn sent one final message. She read it aloud. He says he ruined everything. I said, he only exposed it. She asked, do you hate him? I answered, I don't think about him. That was the truth. He had already lost. Sarah said, I'll do anything. I replied, you already did. Our conversations became brief. Did you eat? Yes. Are you coming home? Late. Silence became my strongest weapon, not to punish her, but to protect myself. She finally said, I understand now. I asked, what? She whispered, I was never special to him. I nodded. You were convenient. She broke down completely then. I destroyed us, she cried. I said softly, you revealed us. The next morning I met the lawyer again. He asked, are you sure? I replied, I'm peaceful. I filed for separation without anger, without revenge, without fear. I sat at the same table, ordered the same food, and waited. The chair across from me stayed empty. I looked at it and said quietly, you don't scare me anymore. The waiter asked, just one tonight? I nodded and replied, just one. Months had passed. Sarah had tried to talk again before this night. She stood in the doorway and said, can we sit and talk? I answered, we already did. She said, I need closure. I replied, so did I. She whispered, do you hate me? I shook my head and said, I forgave you. She looked relieved until I added, silently, for myself. She asked, is there any chance? I replied, that question belongs to the past. She cried and said, Zayn is gone. I said calmly, he was gone long before that. She asked, do you think about him? I smiled faintly and said, only when you say his name. That ended the conversation. At the restaurant my phone buzzed. Adil texted, you good? I replied, better than before. He wrote, proud of you. I smiled and put the phone down. I remembered who I used to be. I remembered how I thought love meant endurance. I remembered how I stayed quiet to keep peace. I spoke to myself in my head and said, you didn't fail. You learned. The waiter placed my plate down and said, enjoy. I answered, I will. I took a bite and realized my hands weren't shaking. My chest wasn't tight. I felt calm in a way I never had before. Sarah had once said, you're too patient. I had laughed and replied, someone has to be. Now I understood patience without self-respect was just fear wearing manners. My sister called me. She said, where are you? I replied, having dinner? Alone? Yes. She paused, then said, are you okay? I smiled and answered, I'm full. She laughed softly. I knew you'd get here. I said, I didn't think I would. She replied, you always do. Zayn stopped existing in my world. No updates. No curiosity. No anger. He became irrelevant, and that felt like justice without noise. I remembered the night everything cracked. The phone lighting up. The pause. The lie. I didn't feel pain anymore when I thought about it. I felt distance. Sarah messaged me once more after weeks of silence. She wrote, I hope you're happy. I typed, I am at peace. She replied, I miss you. I stared at the screen and then put the phone face down just like she used to. The difference was intention. I paid the bill and stayed seated. I wanted to sit with the version of me that once believed love was supposed to hurt. I said quietly, you did your best. I stood up and looked around. Same lights. Same music. Same smells. I felt different. I felt grounded. As I walked out, the waiter said, have a good night. I answered, I already am. Outside the air felt lighter. I breathed in and didn't rush to exhale. I wasn't carrying questions anymore. I wasn't chasing answers. I had not won by proving anyone wrong. I had not won by hurting anyone back. I had won by choosing myself when it mattered. I unlocked my car and sat for a moment. I thought about the man I was when this story started. I thought about how desperately he wanted things to stay the same. I spoke aloud and said, thank you for surviving. The engine started. The road ahead felt open, not empty. Some betrayals don't break you. They finally introduce you to yourself.